Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amit Dogra, a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all in another edition of Wednesday Seminar. Today's seminar is the first one in the series of three organized by ICS to throw light on China's three global initiatives, which include the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative. The title for today's seminar is What to Expect from China's Global Security Initiative. In this seminar, we will explore the motivations, strategies, and implications of China's effort to enhance its role and influence in the international security arena. We will examine how China views its own security challenges and what interests lie behind China's espousal of principles like indivisible security, sustainable security architecture, and its disdain towards bloc politics. We will also discuss what implications GSI posits for the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US and, in effect, India's security interests in the region. Our speaker for today is Mr. Manoj Kewalramani, Fellow, China Studies, and the Chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies Programme at the Takshashila Institution. He is also a non-resident senior associate with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His research interests range from Chinese politics, foreign policy, and approaches to new technologies in addressing questions of how India can work with like-minded partners in dealing with the challenges presented by China's rise. Mr. Kewalramani is the author of Smokeless War, China's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance, which discusses China's political, diplomatic, economic, and narrative responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. He also publishes a daily newsletter translating and analyzing discourses from People's Daily. Prior to joining Takshashila, he spent over a decade working as a journalist in India and in China. Chairing today's session is Lieutenant General S.L. Narasimhan, retired infantry officer who served in the Indian Army for 40 years. He has done graduation in mathematics, post-graduation in defense studies, and PhD in India-China relations. Sir has served as the defense attaché in the Embassy of India in China for 3 years. He speaks Mandarin. His expertise spans international relations and internal issues, the economy, and defense-related subjects of China. Sir is a former member of National Security Advisory Board, India, and the first Director General of the Center for Contemporary China Studies. He is presently a distinguished fellow with the Center of Air Power Studies, India, emeritus faculty with the Rashtriya Raksha University, India. Before I hand over to the chair, let me lay out a few housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box during the event, or you can use the raise hand options. Also, participants are kindly requested to mention their title and affiliation along with the question for better identification. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. That's all. I now hand over to the floor to the chair to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Amit, and thanks for ICS for having me over to preside over this session. And Manoj is a known China watcher for some time now, and one of the early writers of a discussion paper on the Global Security Initiative of China in January this year. But I'm sure the concept paper that came out in February would have given him more insights, which he will probably cover during this session. Out of the initiatives which Amit mentioned, I find one initiative missed out, that is the Global Initiative on Data Security. Starting from the year 2020, you find China coming up with one initiative per year. That is GIDS in Global Initiative on Data Security in 2020, the Global Development Initiative in 2021, the Global Security Initiative in 2022, and on 16th March of 23 this year, the Global Civilisation Initiative. And many of the analysts have been seeing them individually, though I would urge people to look at them collectively and see where it takes it and why China is coming out with so many of these initiatives. That is the first point. The second point is, when we analyzed the Global Security Initiative, immediately after Mr. Wang Yi gave an explanatory statement, and also Le Yucheng, who has been moved out of the foreign ministry later, these two gentlemen gave explanatory kind of speeches after Mr. Xi Jinping came out with that initial announcement of GSI. It gave two clear, distinct points. In addition to whatever Amit said and whatever Manoj is going to say, one thing it clearly indicated is that China is looking at a global security architecture, which is alternative to the present one. And our understanding was that it is not wanting to change the entire architecture, but it wants to leverage this present architecture to suit its requirements. That is point number one. Point number two, Manoj also talks about this in this January paper. The Global Development Initiative somehow or the other pitches into this global security initiative. And since Global Development Initiative is pitching into Global Security Initiative, so is the One Belt, One Road Initiative. So these are all getting linked together into one kind of a concept. The third point I want to mention before I hand over to Manoj is GSA is still evolving. GDA has evolved to an extent to say that 100 countries have agreed to participate in it and 68 organizations have signed MOUs, etc., etc. And it has come out with 50 workable kind of projects to work on, propositions to work on. However, the GSI is still evolving. The concept paper came out in February. The Chinese Foreign Ministry put out a statement saying 80 countries are actually supporting it, but Chinese are known to actually add up these numbers even when the host countries are either accepting the participation or not. So that is still questionable. Some of the countries' websites, if you go to, they have not actually talked about GSA, but the Chinese are. So these are issues that are going to come up, but it is still an evolving kind of a concept. But two things are clear. One, it seems to have an ideological content to an extent. Like, for example, it talks about the West versus China, West policies versus China. That is one. The second, it also seems to have an ideological context. And some of the analysts have written about the ideological context, but it is still evolving. I don't think it is still very crystallized as far as this is concerned. So since this is still evolving, let's hear more about what Manoj wants to tell us about GSI. And let me now yield the floor to Manoj. Please come over. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. And thank you so much, ICS, for hosting me. At the outset, I must caution that while the introductions were going on, my electricity fluctuated. So I'm hoping that there will not be any more of that. But I have a backup in place. So in case that happens, I might just pop out and in quickly. But so let me not just waste any more time, and let me just begin directly with the presentation that I wanted to make. I think some of the things that General Narasimhan has said, my presentation will sort of touch upon that in terms of what are the interlinkages between these different initiatives that have been announced by Xi Jinping. But to sort of get to that, I think I want to begin by looking at why announce these initiatives. And when I think of that, I go back to what exactly is the perception of the world that the Chinese leadership today seems to have. And one can only glean as much as one can from open source content and information that has come out through different diplomats in their meetings with their Chinese counterparts and interlocutors. And obviously the writings, speeches, pronouncements of the senior leadership and the media. So based on that, I think I have this sort of brief chart of what the perceptions and assessment of the leadership are. Firstly, the leadership's worldview, and I think this has been repeated ad nauseum, is that the world order is undergoing turbulent changes, profound changes, if you would like, which are unseen in a century. And one part of that change is that, one key sort of aspect of the change is that the balance of power, the global balance of power is shifting towards the East, with China being the leading power and the leading actor in the East. That doesn't necessarily mean that China has become the strongest power in the world. It just means that the balance of power is shifting. And this is happening not at all peacefully. It is happening in a turbulent environment, which means that there will be tremendous risks that will emerge owing to this. Within this context, Xi Jinping talks about 4 deficits that exist in the world today. There is a development deficit, a peace deficit, a governance deficit, and a trust deficit. If you think of the different initiatives that we've just spoken about, GSI, GDI, and GCI, they are essentially what the Chinese call their solutions, Chinese solutions to these specific deficits, right? The GDI matches with the development deficit, GSI with the peace deficit, GCI with the trust deficit. We don't have anything for governance as of now, but I don't anticipate another 3-letter initiative coming up. But I presume all of this entails governance to some degree. So, he's identifying where there are challenges within the world, and he's basically saying that these are my solutions to try and address these challenges. One other important sort of context that one must keep in mind is, along with these 4 deficits, if you look at the world from Beijing, it's an extremely unstable periphery that it has. It's not necessarily a terribly favorable environment to be in, right? On the east and the south, you've got territorial disputes, maritime disputes. You've got the US with its treaty allies and partners next door. You've got Taiwan, which is an unsettled question. You've got Japan. When you go north now, you've got Russia, which is increasingly looking unstable, although that was one source of certainty in some ways because of the settlement of the boundary dispute and the deepening of the relationship between the 2 countries. But today there are new challenges that are emerging. And again, lots of people have sat and discussed about what Xi Jinping means when he says extreme scenarios. One extreme scenario could be a challenge that happens in Russia, which comes up, right? And that can end up creating lots of problems for Xi Jinping. Again, towards the west, you've got Xinjiang, you've got bordering provinces, Xinjiang and Tibet, and you've got obviously the stans, and the stans are not necessarily entirely stable. And there's been lots of investment from the Chinese side to try and ensure security in that region. And then, of course, you've got India, which, again, the relationship is at its lowest that it has been since the 1962 war. So it's not necessarily a very optimistic scenario when you look out from Beijing along the periphery. So the periphery is a challenge. And finally, broadly from a development point of view, given the changes that are taking place and given the nature of the competition with the United States, I think Beijing understands that it wants to become much more self-reliant in many areas, whether it is, just broad economic circulation, from keeping its manufacturing going, given the shrinking external demand, to whether it is core technologies and things like that. But at the same time, it recognizes that, look, to be able to meet its development goals, it needs deeper economic engagement with the rest of the world. And therefore, you see this strange dichotomy where at one point of time, you're cracking down on firms, you're trying to, hamper certain kinds of activities. At the same time, Li Qiang is saying things like, hey, look, we want investment, we want people to come in, and we're open to foreign investors, come and invest. China is still an opportunity and all of that, right? So you've got this dichotomy that exists because there is a realization that while you need to become self-reliant, you also still need foreign capital, foreign talent, foreign expertise, foreign technology to come in. Within this worldview, I think there's an opportunities prism and there's a threat prism. The opportunities prism is quite straightforward, that there is enhanced capacity within the Chinese state than ever before since the formation of the PRC. Today, there's so much more national power that has been accumulated. There's so much more state capacity to do many more things. And there is tremendous performance legitimacy that is enjoyed at home, but also in terms of perception abroad. The China's development has yielded these positive outcomes over the last 40 years. And that you can see in terms of how states are now engaging with China also, right? They're seeing that there is maybe something to what they're doing which works. Likewise, there is relative US weakness, which is the product of the dysfunctional state of the US democracy in many ways, but also its changes in its economy, and which is coupled with sort of, middle power anxiety. The idea that, you can't necessarily rely on anybody in this world. We're in a flux. Yes, you can't get into close partnerships, or you can get into partnerships on certain issues, but not necessarily on everything. And that also means that middle powers are tending to take their own road. So they're going to be much more adventurous when it comes to their policies. And India is an example of this, particularly around the Ukraine war and subsequently. So as much as India is becoming closer to the United States, it's also trying to maintain its autonomy, and many others, even Turkey is an example. At the same time, you see from an opportunities prism from Beijing's perspective, there is these fissures and polarization within democracies, which create opportunities to try and engage in systematically competitive narratives, along with doing other nefarious things. And what this has also done is that it's created this, there's an erosion in this notion that there are certain values that are universal, the idea that the liberal international order existed, or the idea that there are certain liberal norms by which we must function. All of those things have sort of eroded, which have been sort of sore spots in some ways for Beijing because they've seen those as norms of subversion. And today, therefore, you're seeing a new articulation, particularly under GCI. Finally, in terms of threat prism, there is a threat that the United States is engaging in a full-blown strategy of containment. Xi Jinping specifically spoke about this in March at the NPC when he mentioned to businesses in China that you're seeing external suppression blockades and things like that. So this is a really difficult situation, and I think that assessment doesn't necessarily wane despite the recent thaw or whatever that thaw is between the US and China. There is a threat that middle powers might end up bandwagoning with the US to counterbalance China. I think some changes in terms of, say, India's policy with regard to the US, or say the Philippines, changes in Philippines policies, South Korean policies, those give sort of pause for thought in Beijing, that there could be changes that middle powers could end up bandwagoning if if they are not necessarily satisfied. Likely, and lastly, there is a threat that you might end up in a situation where there is a systems and an ideological confrontation, which could lead to tremendous economic consequences and also tremendous security consequences for China. And these are situations that China therefore wants to avoid, right? Therefore, it keeps criticizing the idea of Cold War mentality and all that. So with this threat perception assessment, I know I spent a little bit of time on this, but it's worthwhile doing this. It's worth looking at what China is doing under GSI. One last sort of introductory point is one big part of all of these initiatives is that there is a narrative contest, right? And this statement to me sort of underpins that narrative contest. As much as the Biden administration has sort of tried to talk about competition with China fundamentally being about, values, about democracy, and not about containment, about playing by the rules and a rules-based order, and so on and so forth. The Chinese are basically arguing, hey, look, it's none of this. It's not democracy and autocracy. It's not values. It's a struggle between development and containment of development, and between global justice and power politics. So they are basically saying the US is essentially doing what is doing is cynical to keep up maintain its position, whereas what we are representing is this tide of development of the developing world, of the global south, or whatever you want to call it. And the US is trying to essentially strangle to maintain its hegemony. And this message, along with China's development diplomacy, does tend to resonate reasonably well in large parts of the developing world. But this is something to keep in mind, because all of this is a large part of all of this is also a narrative contest. So on the interlinkages of these different initiatives, I should have chosen not a Greco-Roman design, but a Chinese design. But this was the easiest available vector. All of these four initiatives, BRI, GSI, GDI, GCI, all sort of come within this umbrella of community of common destiny, and they lead to the creation of community of common destiny. What is community of common destiny? This is essentially what the Chinese are offering as a vision of a future world order, right? Where essentially it is development centric, but it is also a case where security issues are not dealt with in block formats. They're dealt with through multilateral agencies, but also the fact that to a certain degree, each country and each actor has its own sort of can act the way it deems best within its sovereign territorial space. Those are sort of some underpinnings of this idea of community of common destiny. Obviously, it's a little bit much more complex than that, but this is the broad order pitch that Beijing is making, and these are components of that order pitch. So what is GSI? As General Narasimhan said, it was announced last year at the Boao Forum for Asia. The number has been updated by the Chinese. Now they say that there are 90 countries and regional organizations that have expressed, quote, appreciation and support. A concept paper was released in February, which outlined 6 principles, 20 cooperation areas, and 5 platforms. I'll go into this in a little bit. The stated objective of GSI is this, that is to eliminate, of the many objectives, one of the key objectives is this, to eliminate root causes of international conflicts, improve global security governance, encourage joint international efforts to bring more stability and certainty to a volatile and changing era, and to promote durable peace, which all sounds wonderful and all sounds fantastic. However, if you note in the paper that I did on GSI, trying to analyze how Chinese diplomats, how Chinese scholars discussed the initiative and sought to interpret the initiative, you see certain trends that are emerging, right? So the revealed objectives in terms of how they interpreted GSI and how they've sort of acted has been that the objective of this argument of indivisible security, which is made under GSI, is that you're undermining the concept of collective security and the US Indo-Pacific strategy. The idea is that by making the case for indivisible security, which is essentially that security, there cannot be absolute security, and everybody's security is interlinked, and therefore block formation and identifying rivals and enemies through block formation essentially undermines everyone's security. So therefore, the argument is therefore to undermine any notions of collective security and the US's Indo-Pacific strategy, which Beijing sees as fundamentally a tool for containment of China's rise. In some of the narrative pushback that we've seen, famously, Wang Yi described the US Indo-Pacific strategy and US containment as 5-4-3-2-1, right? The Five Eyes, the Quad, AUKUS, bilateral agreements, and the US itself, and them having sort of a cascading effect on China's rise and trying to contain it. So this objective is to try and make the case, present a normative idea to make the case for other countries to disincentivize them from engaging with US, because any form of security engagement or deepening of security engagement would be seen as essentially undermining China's security interests. And therefore, the proposition is that, hey, look, if you do that, you violate the principle of indivisible security. The objective is to project China as a responsible major power that is preserving the UN-centered architecture. If you go through the concept paper and if you go through what they're talking about, and if you also go through their approaches, they're essentially talking about leveraging the UN system and using multilateral institutions to operationalize GSI. And the idea, therefore, is that, look, China is operating in a multilateral format as opposed to unilaterally. And it's a major power, which is addressing some of the security concerns that other countries might have. The establishment of regional multilateral institutions, leveraging existing institutions, I've already talked about that. Intensified securitization of China's economic engagement. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but that's partly the revealed objective that you can see from what they're writing, because a lot of the criticism under GSI has also been around the use of US sanctions, the US's use of sanctions, and how that undermines security and therefore human rights and so on and so forth. More active diplomacy from the Chinese state when it comes to addressing hotspot issues. Does that, and we've seen some of this, right? We've seen the Saudi-Iran agreement in which the Chinese sort of swooped in at the last minute and there was an outreach to them at the last minute, and they also swooped in at the last minute to leverage the opportunity, and then have made the case that their engagement has led to this tide of reconciliation in the Middle East. Although, Chinese stake is still fairly minimal in terms of what its security commitments are to the region. And most recently, we've seen a greater desire being expressed to try and engage in the Israel-Palestine issue. So we are seeing much more proactiveness in trying to address regional issues, whether it's at the Horn of Africa, whether it's in the Middle East. And the objective is to essentially try and see that you can, from my perspective, Chinese objective is essentially to try and safeguard China's economic interests and political interests in the region, as opposed to necessarily addressing root causes of conflict. Because in much of Chinese literature, when they're discussing conflict remedies, essentially they're talking about a development prism, which I don't think addresses root causes of conflicts, because often conflicts in these, as we've seen in our part of the world, conflicts tend to be multifaceted with very, very diverse different root causes. A lot of them are social, and addressing them requires far deeper engagement than just the blunt instrument of development. Development is very useful, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So to me, therefore, the objective is to try and see as much as you can safeguard Chinese interests and expand China's role in the region while minimizing its security presence. I'm fairly certain that you are unlikely to see Beijing underwriting security deals through force commitments in the future. Moving on. Some of the platforms that they have talked about, like I said, using the UN-centered engagement system, using these different multilateral groupings such as BRICS, the SCO, and so on and so forth, the GCC platform, establishing new dialogue platforms. There is a Xiangshan forum. There are other forums that try to sort of use some of these to arrive at common discourse and common ideas on key issues. The only one thing that the concept paper talks about, in some sense tangibly, is not just to do more joint drills and educational exchanges, but actually talks about that over the next couple of years, the Chinese government will be providing some 5,000 training opportunities for security officials from countries around the world. So that's one sort of tangible commitment that we've seen under GSI. But a lot of the rest of it seems like an amalgamation of existing policy initiatives under the rubric of GSI, rather than necessarily something new being announced and launched. You can see perhaps new exercises which would have been normal anyway that they would have probably announced, now being bracketed under GSI. One example of this is a Coast Guard cooperation agreement between China and Russia, which allows Beijing greater access to the Arctic, and that's likely to be seen as something that is under GSI. This was announced a couple of months ago. Anyway, so the objectives of all of these, what are you likely to? Sorry, I think what are you likely to see? You're likely to see a range of different measures. In my paper, also I talk about this, that there are likely to be certain traditional security measures, which include joint drills, policing, training of law and security officials. To me, instead of sort of necessarily hard security and sort of traditional military security, you're likely to see much more focus on law enforcement, which will be a big area of cooperation. On that, I have some data which I think I should share with you. Before I come to law enforcement, this is a little bit of a snapshot of current Chinese military diplomacy. I hope you can read all of this clearly. If not, I'll share the slides anyway. But it just tells you that there has been a steady sort of pace in terms of its military exercises and port calls, so and so, since 2010, 2009, 2010. There's not been some massive spike that we have seen. And in terms of its diplomacy by region, you can see that the focus is predominantly on Asia. In terms of its, and even in that, a subset is East Asia, which is where more than half of Chinese military diplomacy has traditionally tended to take place. Africa is also a key actor after that. Those are the two regions where I would say that we should track as much as possible what kind of changes are taking place in terms of Chinese military diplomacy. In terms of Chinese military drills with other countries and other, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, the NDU database gives you 5 types. It classifies them into 6 types of drills. And what you will see is that nearly half of them, just shy of half of them, are military operations other than war. So they are not necessarily serious hard military drills. A lot of them are sort of like HADR and things like that. Anti-terrorism is a key component of Chinese military exercises. And then you've got some 16% of combat military drills, with 4% of combat support exercises. So it's worth noticing the pattern of this and whether the pattern of these drills changes over the period of time, as we see, along with the geographic scope of the drills that the PLA is doing. In terms of arms sales, which is one again going to be sort of classified under GSI, whether it's arms sales, development of, say, infrastructure, military infrastructure, provision of military equipment from, say, transport equipment, cars, vehicles, all of that to different countries. All of that will likely be clubbed under GSI in terms of talking about its merits. But in terms of arms sales, if you see, CIPRI database tells us that, at present, yes, there has been an increase, but essentially, the same old actors, Pakistan, Nigeria, are the key sort of recipients of Chinese weapon sales. But it's again worth watching how this pattern changes and how countries adapt. But again, all of this would have happened regardless of GSI. But the logic is that this will now sort of GSI will become the organizing principle under which all of this gets categorized. In terms of law enforcement cooperation, which is where I think we will see much more immediately. There are 2 sort of broad categories that are classified under. One is Coast Guard cooperation, and one is cooperation under the Ministry of Public Security. The Ministry of Public Security, there are 3 types of actions that it carries out abroad. Unilateral operations, which are done on its own, which may not necessarily have legality. And we've seen so much of this conversation around Chinese police stations, illegal police stations abroad. These are essentially dealing with dissidents, exiles, partly also even the fox hunt campaign that they launched on corruption. It's little wonder why so many Chinese, dissidents or fugitives end up surrendering after 15, 17 years. So this is part of that operation. Bilateral engagement, this is on developing joint understanding on key issues of governance, but also capacity building, providing material support, engaging in joint policing. And then you have multilateral engagement. This is on, say, with things like policing through the Interpol and things like that, but also on rules and equipment sales. Often this happens during these bilateral forums. Also, there's a bilateral forum there's a forum that the Chinese hold. I think it's Luan Yuan Ying or something like that. I can't remember the name right now, but I could be, and I butchered that name perhaps. But there is another forum that takes place on which policing is a key part of it. Coast Guard cooperation. This is again, like I said, the most recent deal was between the Russian Coast Guard and the Chinese Coast Guard. That was focused on the Arctic, but essentially this is a key part of it. And if you see the GSI concept paper, it talks about developing the Lansang Mekong region into a demonstration zone for GSI. Predominantly, that will be around issues of HADR, but also drugs, human trafficking, smuggling, illegal fishing, and joint patrolling. A lot of these joint patrolling, say, mechanisms exist already, but they would, to my sense, they will be sort of categorized within the GSI framework as and when the framework becomes much more solidified. But these are areas that we need to watch out on, because I think that this is where we will see immediate developments in under GSI. The second set of measures that I see are around developmental and financial security issues, predominantly sanction proofing China's economic activities. I think the biggest part of this, or the most immediate part of this, is to look at uh, settling more trade in the RMB. It's again, this is an area that I am also studying much. I also have to spend much more time studying. But from what I understand, that over the last few months, at least, we've seen, a lot more countries, for example, Argentina, Brazil, commit much more to settling trade with China and RMB. Which Beijing has been talking about settling its oil bills with Saudi Arabia and the RMB. And the use of RMB by other countries has gone up in the last 1 year. But it's still not at a scale where it is significant or Chinese trade can be sanction proof. But the objective, I think, will be in this direction, to try and see how much more trade settlement can be done in RMB to begin with. And finally, areas around shaping global governance norms. So all these forums that you're talking about, one of the objectives is to try and shape new norms around in different areas. Again, Chinese positions in these areas in many of these areas has already been established, whether it's biosecurity, whether it's on the issue of terrorism, whether it's space and governance of space, whether it's nuclear technology, whether it's cyberspace, and or human rights. The objective is to try and get more countries on your side, and then to leverage the UN system to try and make the case for your preferred propositions. We've seen this being done very effectively when it comes to human rights from China. But the objective is now to sort of do the same, sort of apply the same sort of model in many of these other areas. And in some cases, you will see initiatives being launched within groups. So, for example, the China Central Asia Data Security Initiative. So the idea is that therefore you create these governance norms within these smaller groupings and then back for them at the larger within the larger UN system. I have one more slide, which is in terms of how has all of this been perceived around the world. We talked about 90 countries. So far, we don't have necessarily survey data for all of these countries that have said that they appreciate and support. And that's important, right? Appreciate and support is important because it tells you that despite all the diplomacy, it's been hard to get buy-in from other countries. It's been much easier to get buy-in on the issue of development, but much harder to get buy-in on the issue of security, because partly it's vague, and because partly it is also pitched in the context of it is fundamentally an alternate view to, it's essentially a geopolitical product as opposed to development, which may not be a geopolitical product. So my final slide is this, which is research done by Huang Tiha, a scholar in Southeast Asia. Her survey from Southeast Asia in terms of how welcoming those countries are to GSI tell you that it's not necessarily a great outlook. There are very few who are very confident or very confident. There's much more ambiguity and concern, which I think is something that you will see replicated in other parts of the world. That said, in my engagements with people from the developing world, Africa, West Asia, the understanding that I get is that while they may not want to be part of any grand plan, a grand project, so they might not want to become friends of GSI like there are friends of GDI, they're more than welcome to see China play a much more proactive role in the region and support them on security issues in the region. So they're not averse to that security cooperation, particularly if it entails capacity building and material assistance. But being part of something that is seen as representing essentially some sort of a loose, vague block, they're not necessarily very keen on doing. I'll stop with that, and I'm happy to hear what everybody else has to say. Gentleman, Narasimhan, you're on mute.
Yeah, I unmuted myself. Thank you. Thanks a lot for that good coverage of GSI. Let me now open the floor for questions, and then I'll come up in the end. That will be, I think, a better way of doing it. So if there are any questions, if people can raise their hands, then I can call them up. Otherwise, even Amit, if you can look into the question, because in the chat box, I don't see any questions here. If any hands are coming up, I can't see all of them on my screen.
Yes,
so if
sir.
anybody is coming up, please call them for
Yes,
call them on.
I will inform you.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat box from
Ambassador. There's a question in the chat box by Ambassador Khan. It says that, I would like to request you to comment or build upon General Narasimhan's suggestion that 5 key initiatives announced by Xi Jinping since 2013 should be looked at holistically. If so, do they represent building block of a China-led global order, which will supplant the declining West-led international order? How will that order look like? That is the question, Manoj.
All right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Kanta. So I agree. I think that it does have, it does reflect of trying to pitch a new order. I do think that it's still very nascent to be able to figure out what sort of shape it will take, but there are some things that we can figure out, right? So, for example, Beijing essentially wants old security alliances to be whittled away. It does not want old form of security alliances to exist. So that's one part of the Western-led order that it wants done away with. Another part of the Western-led order that it wants to do away with is in the context of any sort of unilateral sanctions being imposed. So from an economic point of view, it wants that system to go away. So it wants diversity in whether it's trading regimes, whether it's in values, whether it's in partnerships. It essentially wants diversity because it essentially believes that, look, we are going to be entering a multipolar world, if we are not already in it. And in this multipolar world, any sort of single point universal sort of depiction of any of these ideas does not sustain anymore. So it fundamentally at the heart of what the argument it's making is that it wants diversity in terms of aligned security issues. It relates to diversity in terms of your breaking down of traditional security alliances. In terms of value, it does the trading. It represents much more diverse sort of portfolio of trade in terms of currencies used. The inability of formally sort of disallowing countries from engaging in sanctions and things like that. And you can say no, don't do it, but at the end of the day, it depends on who commands the capacity to do that. So it wants to break the dollar's hegemony, although that's a long ask. And finally, in terms of values, I think GCI represents this quite clearly. It is basically saying that, look, there are certain common values that we all have, and there are these 6 or 8 values. And we each have the right to interpret these values within our sovereign territorial space based on our civilizational experiences. And no one should be dictating to us whether our interpretation is correct or incorrect, and no one should be interfering within our internal affairs based on what they believe is their interpretation of these values. So that's its pitch. And so essentially, I would say that the order that it's arguing for is a multipolar order with greater diversity in economic opportunities and economic engagement in terms of security partnerships and in terms of values.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I can see Mr. Ravi Bhutalingam. Please come in. Is Mr. Ravi there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes. Manoj, thank you very much. You encapsulated the whole concept very, very neatly in a compressed manner in this presentation. And it's really been extremely organized in the manner that you set it out. So thank you for that. So my question is this: as you pointed out, the GSI, under the umbrella of the GSI, are a whole package of materials and initiatives, several of which existed earlier, several which had their own identity. They've all been put inside this box. But I'm just wondering whether in doing so, China must have reasoned that this strategy is going to be better than selling the unbundled package item by item. That packaging it together is a better pitch, as it were. To me, it looks as if this might not be such a good strategy. And evidenced by that last chart you showed about the opinion poll, that when you're asking people to give a blanket opinion, they're a bit shy. They really don't want to put their eggs in any one basket. Though the individual items in the GSI, some of them might be attractive for many people. I mean, take the one on sanctions. Even India may have some sympathy on kind of not firing off sanctions all over the place, very easily. So it seems to be that the bundling approach has really not worked. And whether this will go forward or not. So I'd like your views on this one.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's an interesting point. And I see, if I was to put myself in the shoes of a Chinese, perhaps Wang Huning, and trying to think of what sort of concept should I present, my idea would be that there are two reasons why this bundling has happened. One is that you felt the need to present an idea which sort of presents an alternative vision to what, say, the United States and the West has argued for. And so that's one reason why I think the bundling has happened. That's an external reason, that you want to present an idea of what sort of, because there's been this discussion of, well, okay, China is rising, but what sort of an order does it want? And what will it mean for the security situation around the world? So one part of it, I think, is the need that was felt that you need to present something which is alternative to the United States. The other part of this, to me, is essentially about bringing together very diverse and very bringing together this massive bureaucracy within this single organizing principle, where security permeates all domains, and that must also take the case in terms of your external engagement. And trying to bring together this bureaucracy to think from the point of view of security. So if you want your foreign trade guys to start thinking from the point of view of security, as opposed to necessarily trading and maximization of economic engagement, I think, therefore, this sort of organizing principle helps, where you create this sense that everybody needs to be thinking from this perspective, and it really to think under this broad sort of vision, umbrella vision. So to me, I think those are the two reasons why this has happened. I think that yes, if you go and ask countries the question that would you sign on to GSI, I think one of the first questions that they would have is, what exactly does it mean? Or when I sign on to it, what am I committing to? So that would be a challenge to make, and I think the Chinese have understood that. So while, General Narasimhan said that other countries in their statements don't necessarily talk about GSI, the Chinese do. So that signaling is for their own domestic audience and for an external audience, saying that, hey, look, our initiative is gaining traction. But it's not necessarily what their diplomacy is all about. I think the diplomacy is about cutting those deals, whether it's for arms, whether it's for equipment, whether it's for joint drills and things like that, or whether it's for policing cooperation, whether it's for opening up anti-terror, liaison offices or things like that. So I think that they are also beginning to recognize that there are these differences between the endorsements that you will get and actual action you'll get. And I think the difference between how GDI got traction, particularly at the UN platform, and GSI has not, and they have not even necessarily thought of it to get traction under that, it tells you a little bit about how they are also approaching it. So, I mean, yeah, muddled answer, but the idea is, to me, there's an external argument to make a narrative argument for the world, but there is a domestic argument to be made through GSI, which is to organize the bureaucracy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer, Manoj. I'm going to alternate between the chat box and the raised hands. So I'm going to go to a question which is asked by Mr. Louis Hussain. To what extent should we see all these initiatives taken together as an attempt from China to become a provider of global public goods with Chinese characteristics, with due caveats around use of that term? If so, how much do we need to see more widespread acceptance of those ideas as a semi-coherent whole by other countries?
Yeah, look, I mean, I look at the world simply from the lens of, how every country is fundamentally operating with a certain amount of agency and with pragmatism. And there are areas in which others will be happy to sort of, participate when it suits them. And there are areas in which they will not be necessarily terribly happy to participate. If you look at, China's engagement in the Central Asian region, that is where one part of where GSI is sort of being most actively mobilized. And you had a summit recently. And from what I understand, that essentially Central Asian leaders, their objective is that you want us to repeat the statement, we'll repeat the statement, but let's talk about the actual dealings, what sort of actual exchanges we can have in terms of whether it's training, support, intelligence, any of that sort of stuff. So to them, they see it as a label. From the Chinese perspective, they see it as an organizing principle and as an argument that they're making to the rest of the world. So that's how we should see how other countries are endorsing this. I don't think the endorsement necessarily means that they are signing on to any, because you're not really signing on to anything. You're not really signing on to absolutely anything. So if it pleases Xi Jinping, why not? I'll say that, provided I can get a couple of $1 billion to do something that I wanted to do. So to me, that's how I look at how other countries are looking at it. Now, the impact of this can be that the United States starts to look at this and looks at endorsements of GSI publicly by countries to say that, hey, look, you are essentially wanting to undermine the US-led order, right? By endorsing Chinese engagement. At a narrative level, yes. But I think even other countries will look at what's practically happening. If this is to some degree law enforcement cooperation, which is in mutual benefit, whether it's around, say, piracy, terrorism, then that might not be as problematic. So yeah, so my nutshell answer is look at the components and look at what's actually happening as opposed to necessarily the narrative. The narrative matters, but I think it matters far less than actually what's taking place.
Thanks. Over to Mr. Praveer Kumar. You've gone on mute, Mr. Praveer. Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, now it's unmuted. Thank you, Manoj. I just wanted to ask, I went through all your charts. I was quite surprised that Myanmar is not at all, is finding the entire issue as what you call very, very unappealing. One. Second, I'm very happy that Cambodia and Laos is finding it. You are right on that. But I don't think the data on Myanmar is right. The second is, whatever China is trying to sell, they are, I think, quite convinced that nothing is selling. So do you feel that there is a need now to change the entire strategy, which appears to be something which doesn't appeal to anyone in the world, including their own allies? When you talk to the Russians, I mean to say, those who are educated, all these, whatever you spoke right now, it doesn't appeal to anybody. Even the Chinese themselves feel that they should now go out of this particular, what you call, fixed mindset which the Communist Party and the Standing Committee has. Is there some fresh thinking on their part, or are they going to continue like this and think that, okay, if we do this, people will accept us? Because I don't think people are accepting their ideas because they lack appeal. This is the basic thing I want to ask you. Are you impressed with this, firstly? I want to hear, because you have spoken about everything. You haven't given your impressions.
So which ideas are you talking about? The idea of
global security initiative. Yeah, I talked about all these you've given HADR. Okay. All these are soft issues. The hard power issues you haven't touched. You know, when you talk about weapons, you talk about combat, you talk about this. None of this is figuring into it at all. Except for, you said Pakistan. I saw 3 countries where their trade is, great. I don't think they are appealing to anybody on these issues. Like if you watch their trade, everything appeals to everybody. They've got 80% of Boeing products coming. They've got 80% of the iPad coming. Even the I've got a Dell computer. I believe 80% of the components are Chinese. I don't think their security issues appeal to, if they're not appealing to Myanmar, I would say I'm quite surprised. Obviously, Vietnam is not appeal, but Cambodia and Laos is also quite low in comparison to what it should be.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think I don't agree with the fact that it's not appealing to everybody. I mean, if you look at the world today, if you compare it to what their objective is essentially to say that, hey, look, collective security is an old concept and that no longer works. And we are and essentially we want diversity. So if you look at it from that point of view, there are many in the world who today do agree with that, right? And there are many in India who will agree with that idea while saying, in the context of say what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, where they will say that, look, NATO has been at fault and so on and so forth. So the Chinese are leveraging that opportunity to try and potentially forestall any sort of block formation in their periphery, in their part of the world. So in that context, it does appeal. It does appeal in the context when they're going around the world and saying, look, if you want engagement with us, particularly, we understand you have security challenges. We can help you fill some of those gaps, but we have certain political objectives and we want you to support us in that. So whether that's Taiwan, whether that's Hong Kong, whether that's any of those. When it comes to whether, if you're going to measure it by the metric of how much the Chinese defense industrial, sort of military industrial complex is selling abroad, of course, it's not selling enough abroad as compared to say what the Americans are. It's predominantly catering to domestic Chinese needs, but that trend is also gradually changing. It will take time for it to expand. These are sort of first steps in terms of presenting an architecture where that can expand. But Chinese defense engagement with, say, countries in Africa has expanded. Chinese defense engagement with countries in its immediate periphery have also expanded. And my point is not that today they are at a point where they are saying that they are competing with the West, but they are at a point where they are beginning to frame that architecture for that competition, and their industrial complex, defense industrial complex, will gradually build to meet that challenge going forward. So that is their pitch. Now, whether I'm impressed by it, look, I'm really impressed by the fact that a country with a 12,500 GDP per capita is competing quite effectively from a narrative point of view, and even in terms of swaying others to its point of view, with a country with a 50-60,000 GDP per capita, dollars GDP per capita, right? So it is making that, it is competing. Do I agree with most of these propositions? No, but it is competing, and I think we should not deny that, because it is something that we will also have to deal with. So we should not deny that.
Okay, thank you, Manoj. There is a follow-up question from Ambassador Kanta in the chat box. Does China really want a multipolar world, or it has a distinct preference for a hierarchical order with China at the apex eventually? I will draw your attention to Xi's exhortations on China moving to the center of the global stage by the middle of the century.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of draw the distinction between what it wants and what it sees as realistically possible at in the current circumstances. I don't think that Beijing at present sees the world and says that it can. And again, economics is a key part of that. It recognizes that its expansion of power is still not there where it can sort of construct that hierarchical order. In its periphery, yes. So if you look at its engagement with Central Asia, it is an hierarchical order where China is at the center. If you look at its engagements with different regions of the world also, the fact that you've got Africa and China, CELAC, Latin America and China, you've got these entities. It tells you that it's not necessarily multipolar, but it is hierarchical. But I don't think that I think that there is a recognition that as of today, there isn't the capacity to be able to construct that. One day, perhaps. But as of today, given the way things stand today, I think multipolarity is what they believe is in their best interest. Whether that evolves down the road, given this argument of China being at the center stage of world affairs by the middle of the centuries, one has to wait and see. A lot of that depends on how China itself develops. So yeah, so I would say that there is a tendency to that in terms of their engagement with the world, but in terms of capacity and capability, there is a recognition that they're nowhere close to being at the apex.
Okay, let me now yield the floor to Iram Ashraf. He's vanished. Where has he vanished?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the talk, Manoj. That was very informative. And I'm listening to all the questions that you are currently answering. And I keep on going back to two regional groupings through which we have seen China work towards this security paradigm collectively. So one, as you pointed out, was the SCO, and then the other is ASEAN. And to be honest, the ASEAN situation is actually the way it's worked out, and as far as security is concerned, it kind of is representing the table you put up at the end, where there is very little desire or attractiveness towards China's security initiative. So how China has worked in these two regions as far as security is concerned, and going forward, how that will then touch upon this new initiative that they've developed. So that for me is an interesting comparison to go through. But the main thing I wanted to ask you was, within China even, who's behind it? Whose idea was this? Because there's so many pillars. I love the pillars, by the way. That was very good of you to put them together, the common prosperity thing. But who's behind it? So, and I'd like to know a bit more on that. So thank you very much indeed.
Right, that's a really, really, really difficult question to answer. Just the nature of the Chinese system. Look, I would think that the GSI would partly be the thinking of within the ambit of the National Security Commission, that there would be some thinking which links the idea of holistic security, external security, internal security together. And therefore, there would have been some thinking within the National Security Commission, grouping parameter. Unfortunately, we have no evidence to say so. But just given the broad scope of the initiative, I would think that is where the thinking has emerged from. I don't think this is necessarily purely a military product, of military thinking, because just again, you look at the idea of economic engagement, you look at the idea of rights and cyberspace and so on and so forth. So it's a product of this idea of this overall or holistic concept of national security, and therefore I would think that this would have come within the framework of this Central National Security Commission. But that's my best guess. I don't think that it's really. If I was to compare this to GDI, to me GDI is essentially, a thinking between a sort of a product. If you look at the initiatives under GDI, those are thinking between sort of, the NDRC, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, Commerce, and things like that, where there's much more focus on trying to do human development issues. So sustainable development, it's still linked to the sustainable development goals. So the objective is that. So that I would think that it would therefore come from that stable primarily, with a couple of different bureaucracies engaged in it. Whereas this, I would think, would be within the Central National Security Commission's ambit. But then we never know when that commission meets unless they really want us to know. There are hardly ever any readouts, except for recently we had one. So it's really difficult to say.
Okay, let me go to the chat box. Shantanu Rai Chowdhury has asked a couple of questions. Could we see signing on to the GSI, GDI, GCI by nations being linked to Chinese overseas development aid /BRI investments? The question 2 is, to what extent are these initiatives narrative building measures rather than having tangible aspects that can be implemented?
Okay, so very quickly, I'll do question 2 first. I think they're both. There are tangible steps, but essentially, like I said, to me, GSI is an organizing principle, organizing sort of tool, which brings together external and internal actors. In terms of the activities that are under GSI that we will see, or we're likely to see, I think those are not necessarily unique. That, what I mean by that is that if GSI hadn't been thought of or put together the way it has, these activities would have still happened. But that GSI provides them with this framework. And in that sense, it is a narrative building tool against the idea of the US's Indo-Pacific strategy. But there will be tangible, there will be more tangible sort of steps taken. Could we see signing onto GSI, GDI, GCI by nations? So I am very skeptical. GDI, we already have X number of countries as friends of GDI, 50 different cooperation projects that are currently underway, 32 different deliverables that were announced at that high-level dialogue on global development in 2022, to which India was also part of. So that, I think if you go back to those 32 deliverables, you'll see what is the scope of expansion of GDI. But at present, it is limited to those 50 projects. If you see those projects, those are essentially trying to address issues which are not BRI issues, right? Those are trying to raise China's profile in areas where it has a very weak profile in other countries. So, if you ask countries which are Chinese BRI partners, they will tell you that, look, we want to look at China when it comes to hard infrastructure investments and things like that. But on issues of governance, on issues of sustainable development, on issue of green development, things like that, we partner with the West, with India, and so on and so forth. Aid data has good data on this, and it shows you that the Chinese are not preferred in some of those areas. GDI is trying to sort of address that, where it's trying to link itself to UN Sustainable Development Goals and initiate projects within that ambit, which are also participatory, unlike BRI, which are done by which are done in participation with multilateral agencies, including the UNDP and ASEAN agencies. So that's the objective. So I don't know what it means that we'll see them signing on to any of these. I don't foresee a GSI like 60 countries friends of GSI or even 50 countries friends of GCI. I think these will remain loose just by the very nature of what they are. You might see some common agreements, like I said, on the issue of common values of humankind to things like cultural preservations, of artifacts and things like that. But I don't think you'll see like a grand body of people coming together as friends of GCI or GSI.
What about the second question? To what extent are these initiatives, narrative building matters, having tangible results that can be implemented?
Yeah, I answered that first to say that yes, these are narrative building measures, but those tangible aspects, those tangible agreements would have taken place regardless of GSI. GSI provides it with this broad framework within which this can take place, and that framework is useful for a domestic purpose for organizing large bureaucracies and for an external purpose for narrative.
Thank you. Nishant, please come in.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. In your response to Aram's question, I think you said that the National Security Commission would have some role in shaping this GSI. Now, the Central National Security Commission was also formed right after the concept of comprehensive national security was introduced in about, I think, 2014. And many of the concepts seem very similar to that. It seems as if it's bridging the gap between China's own domestic security agenda and its foreign policy. Because as you showed, there is a great emphasis laid on security cooperation, law enforcement cooperation, and as such. So how much do you see it as an extension of the concept of comprehensive national security? And secondly, at a broader level, of course, there's this narrative element which might serve China, the concept of indivisible security per se, because if there is greater securitization in Taiwan, then perhaps there could be some response and it could be justified as such. But also at a second level, these practical aspects of security cooperation have actually, I think, benefited China more, because in your table, you showed that Brunei and Cambodia, these are the countries that are having a more positive outlook towards GSI. And of course, these are also the countries that have greater law enforcement cooperation. So which part do you think will gain more traction for China if it pushes the concept as opposition to inroads of the Indo-Pacific strategy, or if it looks at it in the other form of like law enforcement cooperation and other things?
Right. Thanks so much, Nishant. So I think if you want to look at what China gains from this, the first thing that we should look at is in my slides, one of my first revealed objectives was to undermine participation, to undermine security engagement of other countries with the United States, because it is essentially characterizing a lot of that as anti-China engagement. if it creates wariness in countries from partnering much more closely with the United States in the security domain, then that would be objective one achieved. So far, whatever it may have said and done, at least in its periphery, you've seen the Philippines and South Korea, who are US allies, deepen their engagement with the US. So it's not sort of dissuaded them with any of these arguments. Likewise, India's military engagement with the US, defense engagement with the US is also deepening. So at least these three countries, it's not necessarily dissuaded, but others in Africa and all, we sort of wait and see. I think there is concern in the Middle East, in Africa, with regard to this idea, and even in East Asia, with regard to this idea of, hey, look, we don't want to be caught up in a Cold War. And this is China basically using that opportunity to make the case that by doing X, Y, Z, you sort of frame yourself as partnering in a Cold War. Now, if you're saying that you're doing this to try and address your security concerns that you may have, we are trying to offer you an alternative, whether it's around, say, negotiations for the South China Sea, whether it's law enforcement challenges that you may have. We're willing to work with you, and we're willing to jointly sort of try and sort that out. Now, it's been doing that in the past also. Today, it's doing this within this context. And for that narrative purposes, GSI is a useful tool. So that, to me, is one big objective. But the areas where I think you will see immediate sort of stepped up action, look at law enforcement cooperation, not just with countries in its periphery in the maritime domain, but also in the Central Asia region. I think that is where you will see significant law enforcement cooperation, particularly in the context of terrorism and Chinese fears of terrorism and instability. In terms of defense diplomacy, I think you'd see far greater focus on Africa. There's already significant attention there, but far greater focus on Africa, whether it is in terms of arms and equipment sales, whether it in terms of building defense infrastructure, providing facilities and equipment. So I think that is another area where we should see action taking place in the next weeks and months to come. In terms of economics, like I said, the big gain would be whether you can try and enhance bilateral trade in RMB and RMB settlement. That's been an objective, and that will continue to be an objective. It's not easy to do that, and it's not necessarily something that will easily gain traction, but that's the objective, right? And it's using this political environment, right, the geopolitical environment right now in the context of US sanctions on Russia to try and make the case that this is in everybody's interest. And finally, in the context of values and norms, that is where, again, I think that we will see much more push and much more acceptance, where, the fact that today India is very prickly, and it's not like India has not been prickly in the past, but, we are far more prickly also when it comes to any conversation on human rights and values and things like that. Beijing recognizes that, right? Countries around the world see that. And the passing of that unipolar moment of US dominance has made it much easier for other countries to sort of push back. And this is allowing sort of Beijing to push ahead a new norm, whether it comes on human rights and issues like that, because those can have consequences for countries. So I think those are the three broad areas where I think we will see far more action, far more quickly.
There are 2 points from Avinash in the chat box. I think I'll call him so that he can explain them and then seek your response on that. Avinash, please come online.
Thank you, sir. So I think the initiatives like GSI at this stage, through these initiatives, China wants to undermine the liberal order. It wants to find the fault in what is being done wrong by the Americans. So Americans are not doing collective security. Americans are pushing self-interest. He also used the word small circles. So it's criticizing Indo-Pacific and Quad in that. So it's like a fault-finding mission at this point of time, and proposing the alternate narrative that China wants to push for, right? So that is my point. So, and like I mentioned in the chat, that China is trying to create these alternate global norms on what to do and how the world should run. And we are in general underestimating that desire to develop those alternate norms. I first noticed this when I was writing a paper in 2017, when that for the first time China gave this a 4-point formula on Israel-Palestine conflict, on how to resolve the conflict step by step. Before that, their statements resembled like what we used to say and what we still say on such issues: peaceful, amicable, mutually beneficial settlements, resolve, resist fighting, and so on. So that is the major point. And I think Ambassador Kantha also mentioned sinocentrism and the desire for sinocentrism, but that is just one of the several ways that Chinese scholars are pushing for a China-centric order in the future. But GSI to me looks like more closely associated with Yan Shuetung's moral realism theory on being right and being on pushing more collective goods, at least at this point. I have not made this connection more closely than this, but I think this is my observation on this as of now. Thank you, sir.
Any reactions to that, Manoj?
No, I agree. I agree with Avinash that I think that what we are confusing sometimes is the gap between ambition and capabilities. And I think we're seeing ambition being expressed, and the capability at present is to, like Avinash said, undermine, but it's also to try and offer alternatives. Those alternatives may entail limited engagement at present because of capabilities, but that will change.
Okay, I have one question. I don't see any other question in the chat box. I have been having this question in my mind for some time. Between the time you wrote your paper in January and now, is there any change in your perception on the GSI?
To a certain degree, yes. So when I wrote it back then, I mean, I don't think that fundamentally in terms of the principles and objectives, there has been any change. But I didn't necessarily anticipate Beijing to be this proactive when it came to, say, the Middle East. I didn't anticipate that it would engage so aggressively, say, on the Israel-Palestine issue. And today it is pushing on that issue to a certain degree. So I didn't anticipate that degree of proactiveness in its foreign policy engagement. In terms of law enforcement, I mean, I didn't also anticipate necessarily how interlinked all these initiatives would be in terms of presenting a holistic picture of a world order that China wanted. I mean, yes, I did see linkages between them, but not necessarily once the GCI came into being, it sort of started to fall into place that, okay, this is something that they're offering as an alternative vision for a world order. I saw it largely from the perspective of pushing back against the US and trying to also identify where it can create space for its own interests. But yeah, so those are the two things that I think where my percentage. I mean, I still think that it is, a part of, a lot of this is for a domestic organizational perspective. And that is something that I think I have also come to appreciate in the months since I published that paper, that how much of this is meant for your own people to try and organize the bureaucracy, which I think is something that we often don't think of because we think of the Chinese state as unitary and therefore everything works in concert top down. So yeah, I think those are the sort of changes that that is in my thinking.
Okay. Are there anybody else who wants to come in, or can I close in with my remarks? Nirmal Panda has asked a question. Any comment on China's relation with Cuba? There are reports that China intends to have a military base in Cuba. Your take on this, please.
Yeah, I've not necessarily followed that story very well, but what I understand is that, the base has already existed. There is some facility improvement and expansion that's taking place. But again, not a good person to ask about that.
Okay, I'll cover that because, you see, I've been noticing an increasing trend of China to create bases around the world. They started with Djibouti. Gwadar is being talked about, but it is still quite some time away. There are 12 other places in which they are trying to make efforts to make bases in the areas which are east of Atlantic. This one has come up. This was a listening post earlier in Cuba, which is getting upgraded, and they say that it has been existing since 2019, and therefore it is going to be a listening post kind of a thing, which is situated in Cuba. The issue is, if China wants to become what it wants by 2049, it has to have bases all around the globe. That is the way you can control, or that is the way you will be able to influence outcomes in those regions. And today, the only country which can do that is the USA. They've got 800 odd small and big bases all around the world. And anywhere anything takes place, within about 4 to 6 hours, they react. So that is the kind of system which the Chinese will be looking at. I'm not saying that they will reach it there, but that is the effort. So therefore, you will see an increasing kind of reporting on these bases coming up everywhere. Before this, you would have also read about Cocoa Islands. It was in the news. So you will find more and more of these creation of bases by China in the next 5 to 10 years. You will find them a lot more happening and a lot more appearing in the news. I hope I answered that question. Okay. Well, I have a few points which I wanted to cover. First thing is, we missed the building blocks. Even for GSI, if you started looking at the building blocks which started appearing in the month of March 21, when Wang Yi went to the Middle East, the West Asia, and then started proposing a 5-point peace and security plan, right? And then he goes to Sri Lanka, gives a forum for island nations in the Indian Ocean region. Then he goes to South Pacific, the Pacific Island countries, and try to get them to sign a security pact. And then you find Xi Jinping announcing this GSI. So similarly, you will find building blocks for all of these coming up slowly and steadily. As long as we can identify those building blocks quickly, I am sure you'll be able to latch on to the initiative that is going to come up. And each initiative as it pans out, the moment it is announced, there is a sense of nebulousness, I would say. There's a sense of not being clear about whole thing, and slowly and steadily, it gets built up into a particular actionable kind of a plan. So this is the trend you will see in One Belt, One Road initiative. This is the trend you will see in GDI, GIDS, everywhere. You will find this coming up slowly and steadily. Even in this GSI, there is mention about data security, and that is where it links to GIDS. So that is why I said you need to look at each of these initiatives as a whole and then see where it takes China to in the world stage. That is point number one. The second point is on issue related to the neighborhood, which you talked about. Look at the way China has handled the neighborhood. It's absolutely interesting. ASEAN, they actually decimated the ASEAN, the unanimity by actually dealing with them bilaterally. And Laos and Cambodia are clear examples of the even in favor of GSA. If you see it, those are the two countries which will always favor China. So that unanimity factor has been broken, which was the basic principle on which ASEAN functions. Look at the Central Asian republics. You find China going in for a C+C5. Even today, the Central Asian republics are part of the CSTO, and the C+C5 is slowly and steadily gathering speed. And the summit meeting which Mr. Xi Jinping had recently actually is making more and more inroads into that territory. And that is something, and look at South Asia. When COVID was at its peak, they held a 4-nation meeting, then extended it to 6-nation meeting, and then carried on doing that, and then had that meeting of 19 nations in November 22. And that is something which they are trying to do. So slowly and steadily, what they are trying to do is to enhance that neighborhood coherence with China. And that is part of the friendly neighborhood policy, which is the officially stated policy of China. That is one. Second thing is the enhanced capacity and performance legitimacy that you talked about. The enhanced capacity, I don't know whether it is still there. It was there a few years ago, 3-4 years ago. If you ask me whether they have that enhanced capacity even today, I have my doubts. Because the investments into One Belt, One Road initiative have gone down by 55% starting from 2019-20 onwards. So they have a problem coming up. Their economy is still not caught up. It will catch up, I'm sure. I'm not saying it will not catch up. It is not caught up again. And so the enhanced capacity that we talk about, I'm not sure whether the Chinese have still got it. And the performance legitimacy, what you're talking about. The Chinese went and announced victory too early for the COVID. The COVID second wave caught them badly. So the performance legitimacy, which they were trying to say that, our system is better than the Western system in handling crises like this, actually was proven wrong. So on both these counts, I do have my doubts on whether China has got it there or not. On US-China, the last few months, I don't know, this is my observation, I may be wrong. If somebody can correct me, I am willing to take it. In the last few months, I see a tendency of the US being more keen on evening out the relationship with China. The way they push for meetings of Austin, the way they push for meetings of Blinken, and the way he went there and the results of that meeting tells me that US seems to be more keen on maintaining better relations with China than vice versa. The other thing is on the GSI. The way you explained everything, and I also read some quite a bit of this on this, it tells me that GSI seems to be one way of protecting China's own interests. Look at the way sanctions are being, they are worried about the auxiliary sanctions that could come up if they support Russia openly. And there are a lot of issues which tell me that probably this is one way of putting up a front for making others to join them to protect their own security interests than of making a worldwide kind of a GSI. The focus on you talked about the military operations other than war being a major factor in their exercises. You were there in China, I was there in China. I have followed these exercises very closely, and all of them are done under the premise of MOOTU, TW, military operations other than war. But you look at the composition of the forces, look at the equipment that is being deployed, you find it is more conventional than any of the military operations other than war. So it is a way to hide the conventional capability building, conventional experience building in terms of military operations other than war. So we should be very, very careful in analyzing this, because they'll put out this and then they say, okay, we are doing only military operations other than war. It is definitely not true. So that is something that we need to be keeping in mind. You talked about unilateral operations. I think you had it in mind, but you talked about it a little bit, but you didn't mention it clearly. Look at those illegal police stations which have come up all over the world. Now, all the countries are waking up now, but these illegal police stations actually precede GSI, GDA, and every other I. So the problem that comes up is China has been doing this for a very long time. Now trying to legitimize is something which you can also look into in some form or the other. The currency swap agreements. Now, the currency swap agreements have been gaining momentum. As you said, Argentina has signed it. The European Union has renewed it. A whole lot of other people have done it. There are almost, I can see at least 43 to 45 countries on currency swap agreements with China today. So slowly and steadily, the internationalization of the yuan, which will also pitch into GDI and One Belt One Road initiative, will come into play. So this is another factor that I think we need to be keeping in mind. The multipolar world, which we talked about, to respond to Ambassador Khan's question on this, I get a feeling that multipolar world is something that they are putting out there, but heart of hearts, they would prefer a unipolar world with China being the pole. That is the bottom line we need to be clear about. Today, like Manoj said, I agree with him. Today, they may not have the capacity or the capability to do it, but they are slowly building it up. And when you look at 2050 and the way at which they'll be growing even at 3 or 4% growth, if you look at it, I think they'll be somewhere there. So don't look at what actually happening today. Please look at how it will be 10 years, 20 years, 25 years down the line. You get a different picture on this particular issue. And lastly, I am yet to find any project not covered under One Belt One Road initiative. Any project. You take anything, they put it under those 5 heads which they gave it when they gave it in 2013. And any project that they do has been actually dovetailed into the One Belt One Road initiative. And so to say that some of the projects are outside BRI, I have my very serious doubts, because any project that they have been insisting or pushing anywhere in the world has been under the rubric of One Belt One Road initiative. So with those remarks, I must thank Manoj for an excellent expose and the participants for a wonderful question and answer session. If there are no other questions or no other remarks, let me hand it over back to the organizers.
Thanks, Lieutenant General Narasimhan, for your concluding remarks, and thanks to Mr. Manoj Kewalramani for such an enlightening session. With this, we would wrap up the session, and we thank all the panelists for giving us their precious time and all the participants for listening patiently. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube platform. We would like to welcome everyone to next Wednesday seminar. We at ICS conduct Wednesday seminar, and information related to the same will be available on the ICS website, or you could also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you.